So I'm here to talk about the work we're doing at the Center for Gun Violence, the Philadelphia Center for Gun Violence Reporting, and it's in some ways it's a 16-month-old organization, but in other ways it's the culmination of 40 years of my work, as well as the important contributions of partners, collaborators, supporters, and so on. I'll put a deck together to help guide me through this and cue me to tell you a few things. And I understand at the end we'll have some time for questions and answers. So I'm going to try to share my other screen now. Hopefully you'll see the presentation deck in a moment. Thanks. Okay, so as I said, the Philadelphia Center for Gun Violence Reporting we're based at Community College of Philadelphia, but that's really for now a loose hosting relationship. It's been complicated because launched during the pandemic. Imagine being on campus by now, and still I'm working remotely. I haven't even met many of the people I work with at CCP face to face at this time. But it's working out, and I'm grateful for their support and excited about what might come of it, that relationship moving forward. I hit the next slide. Sorry, I'm having a little challenge with the presentation deck. Okay, there. So for background, I've been around journalism for 40 years. For nearly 30 of those, I was a photojournalist, and I spent 17 of those at the Philadelphia Daily News. And it breaks my heart. Some of you may remember, but when I talk to younger, when I talk to early career journalists or journalism students now, I have to let them know that the Daily News was the leading source of local news in Philadelphia at a time when the Inquirer had bureaus around the country and around the world. If you wanted to know what was happening at City Hall, in the courts, in the streets, at the stadiums, we were really the place to go. And I'm really proud of that work. My background was mostly in, I did most of my work in what we used to call spot news photography, what people more often call breaking news now. I started my career in Boston, and that meant covering things like fires and accidents and severe weather. But after moving to Philadelphia, and coincidentally, it will be 30 years ago tomorrow that I moved to Philadelphia to join the Daily News. When I moved to Philadelphia, it meant covering a great deal of gun violence. Over 30 years at the Daily News, and I'm sorry, over 30 years in Philadelphia, but during my 17 years at the Daily News, I would estimate that I arrived at close to 2,000 shooting scenes, which is a great deal of gun violence, of course. And it informed me in many ways, but at the same time, that only represents about 10% of the shooting victims and incidents during that same period. Just for some more background, I also spent a year reporting from Iraq during the war for the Associated Press. By the end of that period, my team had been awarded the Pulitzer Prize for breaking news photography. But I came back to Philadelphia. I had worked at the Daily News for a while after that, and I in fact, I've left Philadelphia 4 times for a year each time to either study, teach, or report from other places, and came back all 4 times. And very much home for me, and where I want to make the most difference. After leaving the Daily News in 2008, I spent a lot of time teaching journalism at 5 different colleges and universities, but including the University of Missouri, one of the years that I went away. But in 2019, I was offered a fellowship at the Reynolds Journalism Institute back out at the University of Missouri. Missouri is always on the short list of leading journalism schools in the U.S., and the first one, in fact. But in this case, I got this fellowship to create this organization I first called the Institute for Better Gun Violence Reporting. And I also got although it was a residential fellowship that led to a lot of collaborative opportunities at Missouri, I also got the green light to do all of my field working back here in Philadelphia. I wanted to advance the practice of reporting on gun violence and see if that could actually result in preventing violence. There were 3 main goals of the fellowship. One was to convene some events. Another was to develop a set of best practices for reporting on gun violence. And the third was to create an enduring center, which I have now, and hopefully it will endure. But I want to tell you about a couple of our events quickly. These are photos from the Better Gun Violence Reporting Summit, which we convened at WHYY here in Philadelphia in November 2019, basically just before the pandemic. 250 people attended. Journalists came from the New York Times and the Los Angeles Times and everywhere in between. And they came from large and small newsrooms, legacy or traditional newsrooms or digital first newsrooms, community newsrooms, and individual journalists as well. On the stage, we had journalists who cover gun violence locally and nationally. We had researchers from a spectrum of disciplines that study gun violence prevention, from public health to criminology and criminal justice, science communications, epidemiology, and so on. And we had community representatives. The community panel, community representatives were all local in this case, kind of because that's where my network is on the community side, but also it made sense for the local audience, of course. In advance of the summit, we had another event. I had at first thought we'd do it all on the same day, but I learned that community partners wanted their own day. About 2 months before the summit, so September of 2019, we convened a community conversations day in a conference center up at Temple University Hospital in North Philadelphia. And we brought together 30 people from the community who reported having been, significantly affected by gun violence, either as, survivors or co-victims, or in some cases, even past perpetrators who wanted to get involved and help prevent violence. And we brought them together for a day with 15 journalists from Philadelphia who each play some role in covering gun violence. And while actually there's a new job listing out there now, but at this moment, there's nobody working on the gun violence or gun violence prevention beat alone in Philadelphia, but everybody works on it a little bit, whether you're on the police beat or the crime beat, but even, headline writers, assignment editors, photo editors, and so on, photographers. Almost everybody seems to have some relationship with covering gun violence. Sports reporters find themselves covering stories of students being wounded or killed from time to time. And so on this day, we had, this was very exciting. First of all, we had a preliminary trauma talk with an expert from the city's health department. And that was surprising for me. It was one of my blind spots to discover how new the idea of addressing trauma was to both the folks in the community and the folks on the journalism side. After that, we had some speed networking sessions so that everybody, all the journalists and all the community folks got to meet each other and, trade contact info, explain what they do, ask each other why they do things the way they do, but, most importantly, look each other in the eye and, hear each other's voices. And then finally, we did some focus group research that I might get back to later. And that hasn't been published yet, but in a nutshell, we're looking into how the community feels about gun violence reporting. And to put it mildly, they feel that there's plenty of room for improvement. Yeah, it's safe to generalize, I think. I'm sorry for the delays. Okay. And here is, these are just the headlines from our set of best practices for journalists reporting on gun violence. And these are at our homepage. We have two sites. I'll have links at the end. IBGVR is the Initiative for Better Gun Violence Reporting, the original project. And that's where we have these best practices on the homepage. And so you could visit ibgvr.org and click on each of these carrots and learn more. And then I'll get to the other site afterward. So the next few slides are kind of nothing graphic, but they're kind of grim. I just want to talk about the state of gun violence in Philadelphia. I'm sure, nobody's oblivious, but sometimes the details can escape us if you just follow through the news reporting. This is a live map as of a few days ago of shooting victims in Philadelphia during 2021, mapped by, it's on a map at the site maintained by the Philadelphia Office of the Controller. The red dots are fatal shooting victims. The yellow dots are non-fatal shooting victims. But there are lots of dots under each other. You can't even see them all. And it's been like this for many years, but worse this year. This is a weekly tally that I keep of total shooting victims, fatal and non-fatal in the city. This is all 2021. So you can see in the best weeks, it sometimes has been under 30 per week, and on the worst weeks, close to or over 70. Just one update: this latest week, you can see a downward trend over the last 5 weeks that looks really promising at first. However, unfortunately, an update to this data that I haven't added to this visualization yet shows that the week ending on last Sunday actually totaled 40, not 22, reversing the trend. But as you can see, these ups and downs are not uncommon. Here's a look at the monthly graph of the monthly totals. And this is open city data, the data that the city makes available of shooting victims in Philadelphia. And you can see that there are seasonal highs and lows and random erratic changes. But most importantly, you can see that the totals have kind of gone through the ceiling since the outbreak of the pandemic. So as you can see, in the best weeks, in the coldest weather, in the best months. And the coldest weather, we might have had fewer than 100 victims per month from 2015 through 2019, and now now we're seeing spikes close to 300. I think the higher one is 282, if I recall correctly. This is on our other site, the Philadelphia Center for Gun Violence Reporting is at pcgvr.org, and there's a link to this tracker, and just to bring you more up to date, as of last week, October 26th, a little more than a week ago, there had been 1,844 people shot this year in Philadelphia, a slight increase, 1.2% increase over last year, but maintaining an enormous increase over the previous year, as you can see in the top left corner. When I think 2,230 people, if I'm doing my math right, were shot during 2020. At a glance, you can see, as of the 26th, 155 people had been shot this month. 27 of them had died. You can see, and of course, the suffering is not distributed evenly. You can see that young people are suffering the most, but plenty of others as well. And the greatest discrepancy is the racial disparity. More than 75, and this is looking at the data from 2015 through last week. And more than 75% of the victims were identified as Black and male. So that's Black men, grown men, teens, and little men. And if we were to break this down further, less than 5% of the victims, all but 5% of the victims were identified as could be identified as people of color in the city's demographic breakdown. Here's just another. This is from the city's health department site, and unfortunately, this data is scattered over police websites, Open Data Philly, the health department, the DA's office, and others. But from the health department site, here are the annual totals since 2007, a longer time, and you can see what an exceptional problem we're having right now, or through 2020. And as I said, this year we're running very slightly ahead of 2020's pace. But this is probably the most telling visualization that I have here today. The map on the left shows percentages of people living in poverty by zip code, and on the right, the count of non-fatal and fatal shooting victims. So, and I partner with folks in other cities, especially Kansas City, but in several others, and we see this sort of correlation everywhere. So there's the most crystal clear correlation is that people living in areas with poverty or deep poverty are suffering the most gun violence. So how does Philadelphia fit in among other cities? That's Philadelphia. This is I'm looking at a site here. This is a screenshot from a site called American Violence. It's online at americanviolence.org. It's maintained by a Princeton sociologist named Patrick Sharkey, and he and his team compiled data from cities across the country. And so looking at the first 20 years of this century, that's Philadelphia highlighted in the middle there. And, sort of in the middle on the scale, but most American cities are well below Philadelphia's average. This is the this is the murder rate, to be more specific. You can sort by non-fatal and fatal shootings as well, but this is the murder rate per 100,000 victims over the last 20 years, as you can see at the top. And in Philadelphia and in many American cities, the homicides are made up of about roughly 80% gun deaths. In fact, more so in the last couple of years. So they pretty much fall along the same lines. If you want to break this down a little further, if you look at the murders per 100,000 over the last 20 years in America's largest cities, the 9 cities with populations of 1 million or more, you'll see that Philadelphia has had the highest rate for most of the years of the century. And the other city that's been in the running is for the highest rate per capita, murders per capita, is Chicago. And you may have noticed Chicago gets many more headlines because while they have, roughly our rate of murders, they have nearly twice our population. So their numbers are greater, but the problem doesn't get much greater in large American cities than what we're suffering here in Philadelphia. So, this is the central hypothesis of all of our work. What if changing the way journalists and news organizations report on gun violence could prevent shootings and save lives? And just to be clear, I don't think this is the top priority, the one thing we should all do to end gun violence. I'm looking at what journalists can do and what journalists and journalism and news organizations can do to prevent gun violence. And I could talk a lot more about what brought me here, but that's really not why we're here today. But it's a convergence of theory from the disciplines of peace journalism and solutions journalism and trauma journalism. Some journalists would argue that it's not our responsibility to focus on outcomes. It's our job to observe and report, and society should do the rest. I disagree, but I actually respect those who feel differently as well. Anyway, so here's what we're doing at the center. We can kind of break into three buckets: service to journalists, our research collaborative, and a community reporting project. I'm going to tell you a little bit about each. So in terms of service to journalists, well, we started with our summit. As I said, 250 people came to WHYY for a day, and we imagined at that point continuing with more live events, but the pandemic has made that impossible. This is, at this point, the least structured part of our work. It's the part that really amounts to just me. I find myself, frankly, back channeling with journalists locally and nationally in terms of helping them, sort of diversify the Rolodex of experts that they turn to when they want to report on gun violence, rather than just relying on police sources, hearing from experts, researchers in more disciplines, as I mentioned, but especially hearing from leaders in the community. There's a popular cliche that those closest to the problem are closest to the solution. And I think that's an important consideration. I also try to help them find data or analyze data or other resources, other information to help with their reporting, and help them find some of the best previous reporting that they can learn from and build upon. The second component is our research collaborative. And this is Dr. Jessica Beard. She's a trauma surgeon up at Temple University Hospital. She treats gunshot victims every day and night that she works. But she's also an esteemed public health researcher focused on most of the time on gun violence prevention. Thanks to support from the Stoneleigh Foundation, Dr. Beard has joined the center as our director of research for 3 years, beginning a few months ago on July 1st. But the truth is, we've been collaborating for several years already. In fact, getting connected with Dr. Beard had a lot to do with me pivoting back to gun violence prevention after I'd been working on some other projects for a few years. So right now, we're at some point soon, probably soon. At some point, we're going to announce our research collaborative. It's a partnership with lead researchers, including a professor of nursing at the University of Pennsylvania, who's also a former trauma nurse, and a journalism professor at Lehigh University, who coincidentally was once a Daily News photographer like me about 15 years ago. And we've got lots of plans, but for now we're doing some, and with a team of assistant researchers, some extensive media monitoring. We're looking at news reports from all 4 TV stations in Philadelphia during every day of 2021, and that data will probably, we imagine, inspire lots of studies in terms of what gets covered, which victims. If the suffering isn't evenly distributed, you can believe me that the news coverage isn't either. In a previous study, I was generously named a co-author, but a previous study led by Dr. Beard, we established that Philadelphia was among a few cities where at least half of the shooting victims are never represented in the news in any way, not by one channel on one occasion, or in any media, in the newspapers or online or in any way. And so, and I want to start lecturing on all of these facets, but I'll keep moving forward. And then the other important thing they're working on is that they've, and I'm not participating in this directly, but Dr. Beard and the other two lead researchers have been interviewing gunshot patients when they return after they're stabilized and go home for a while, and then they return to the clinic for continuing care at Temple. They interview them about how they feel about the coverage, or more often the lack of coverage, of when they were shot, but also how they feel about coverage of gun violence, community gun violence in general in Philadelphia. And we just, and because, you know, they named me again because I advised on this, but we just submitted an abstract to an organization called SEVERE, which is an injury prevention research organization. But I think you're going to see a lot more come of this. And I'm really excited. That's what I should tell you about. I'm really excited because this is where I think we might have the most impact on practice change. So I digress for a moment. I'm old enough to remember when suicide was covered like novelty by news organizations, that it was, you know, treated as almost entertainment, that somebody chose to end their life in a spectacular, you know, possibly public way. And then the news industry, it was mostly newspapers then in the 1990s, was presented with evidence that showed that reporting on gun violence could be correlated with, you know, I misspoke. Reporting on suicide could be correlated with, you know, copycat suicide in the areas of their circulation. And it changed the standard practice. And since then, news organizations don't report on suicide as a rule of thumb, and then there are guidelines for making exceptions. If there's a public figure involved, perhaps in a public place, and a great disruption to, you know, public activities. So if you may recall, maybe 10 years ago, a Philadelphia politician was threatening to leap from City Hall, and that would probably qualify. I mean, who am I to judge? But might qualify as a valid exception of when a suicide should be covered. But by not covering the others, we diminish the risk of leading to others, you know, imitating the behavior. Similarly, we think that if we present evidence, we think we may be seeing evidence that current news reporting is doing harm, all sorts of harm. And if we present the news organizations and industry with this information, that they might change the way they're reporting. And this is a good time for me to talk about this. So in a nutshell, what we think is that we see so far is that we're seeing too much shallow episodic reporting. An 18-year-old male was shot at the corner of this and that, and another was shot here, another was shot there. It says you should be very scared. It says maybe you should get a gun to protect yourself. It says you should be afraid of the people in this video. It doesn't tell you how to help prevent violence. And there's a whole other subject, right? There's a deep body of knowledge around gun violence prevention that's seldom in the news. So we think there should be less episodic reporting and more reporting on solutions to gun violence. And we think this research might lead us down that path. Sorry for the long explanation. There's so much more I want to tell you about this. And then the third component. So we have services to journalists. We have the research collaborative, and then we have the community reporting project. It's called the Credible Messenger Reporting Project. And in this project, we bring people from the community together with professional journalists, people from the community to work as community journalists, partnered with journalists who have had, spent a career in these organizations, advanced professional journalists, to report together and to report on root causes, lived experience, and possible solutions to gun violence from the community perspective, but with their combined authority. And we just wrapped the first cohort, the pilot project, in August. There are 8 projects. This is Never Ending Emotions is a video produced by Credible Messenger journalist Kim Kamara. She's in the frame here. Kim is one of many of our participants. And as I said, the community journal, I'm sorry, I didn't say this specifically. The community journalists have all self-reported being involved, being affected dramatically by gun violence. And Kim lost her son. He was shot to death. She's from Philadelphia. He's from Philadelphia, although he was shot to death in Harrisburg 4 years ago. And she led she produced one of the most remarkable documentaries with interviews of a couple of moms to explain the experience, and but also with a handful of community leaders to focus on possible solutions. Another one, oh, some of you might, I guess you might recognize this room. Kim Kamara, you may all know this, hosted an event. We had a community screening of Never-Ending Emotions at the Ethical Society just a couple of months ago, and it was, fabulous event, as you might imagine. And this is something I didn't imagine, by the way. So my goals were that the folks from the community side would, learn some new skills, build out their networks, expand their reach, gain more power in terms of storytelling. I didn't require, expect, or imagine a live community events, and three of the participants have already held live events, and so which lead to some deep conversations on gun violence prevention, including this evening. I could talk about any of these slides all night, all day. This is another one of the productions was called The Path Forward. This is Dr. Dorothy Johnson-Spite. She's the founder and executive director of Mothers in Charge. In my opinion, the leading gun violence prevention community in the city. Full disclosure, I might be biased. I'm on the board and I've worked with Mothers in Charge for many years in many ways. But during this video, she stops at her son Khalik's grave. He was shot to death 20 years ago in Philadelphia. And but the most of this video is a panel discussion with including Dr. Dorothy and three other moms who they all lost sons to gun violence, and they talk about, it's so incredibly intimate and powerful. They talk about everything from first getting the news, which is difficult to imagine, to learning how to cope and learning how to thrive and learning how to make the best of that experience in spite of, and while at the same time, of course, it stays with them forever. These are incredibly grotesque oversimplifications of really important stories, but I'm trying to get through this here. Maxine Gooden at Wright was actually the producer, the credible messenger, and but also stepped into this video when a young man got a little choked up. This is a third of another of the video projects from the first cohort, and she's had several events. That's what I was going to show you. Related to her film. We had one at the Aubrey Arboretum up in Northwest Philadelphia. As you can see, Channel 3 came and covered it, and we actually had a companion panel discussion, as we did at the Ethical Society. But they also interviewed Maxine and the video producer, who's also from the community of people affected by gun violence. Maxine also organized a Zoom premiere, Zoom, but no, I'm sorry, it wasn't Zoom. An online premiere on it was a Facebook Live to reach a larger audience. And so here you can see the team. Maxine Gooden was the top left was the credible messenger journalist. Taj Devor at top right, also affected personally, was the video producer. Bottom right, Chris. Oh, I'm having a brain cramp. Chris is will come to me. Chris is a retired Inquirer reporter who is the advisor, and Ambition the Poet is a moderator that Maxine brings to her events. Okay, so briefly, I just want to give a moment, shine some light on the organizations that help support the Center for Gun Violence Reporting. Most of the funding has come from journalism organizations. In the one instance so far, and there may be more, that we've accepted community funding. It was from the Philadelphia Office of Violence Prevention. All of that funding goes back into supporting the community, mostly in direct compensation, but other sorts of support as well. And the Stoneleigh Foundation, of course, supporting Dr. Beard's fellowship at the bottom there, and a handful of others. But maybe even more importantly, and I wish I had time to talk about all of these, is that the organization is, as I said, powered by partnerships that include every sort of organization, as you can see, other news organizations, but Action Tank is a volunteer community of U.S. military veterans who want to give back now. Age Datalytics, there's a leading data journalist, not data journalist, criminologist and sort of crime data analyst with a company in New Orleans who offered to build that tracker for us. Billy Penn is a newsroom partner where they publish our newsletter every week, and I could go on, but it's a modest organization. In spite of that previous list, it hasn't been a great deal of money, but the partnerships mean the world. This is the website of the center, pcgvr.org, the Philadelphia Center for Gun Violence Reporting. You can see all of our credible messenger project, and the left column is broken down into those 3 buckets I mentioned: the Credible Messenger Project, the Research Collaborative, and the Service to Journalists. So you can find a whole lot more on that website, all sorts of resources, especially under the reporting resources tab near the top right. You can find some of the other best reporting on gun violence and resources intended for journalists, but can be informative for anybody interested in gun violence prevention. So yeah, there's the URL again, pcgvr.org. There are opportunities to like and follow us in social media. You can contribute, contact us, subscribe to the newsletter. I'll get back to the newsletter, but when it comes to contributions, individual contributions have been helpful, but we don't really have a system actually for pursuing and organizing for a campaign for individual contributions. So we'll take them. But the reason I bring it up now is I think the sort of golden opportunity, because I think we're going to make an important difference, is that I just always ask if you know anybody with deep pockets and aligned interests already. I think that's where the magic happens. So if you hear from someone who's interested in a new angle in violence prevention or violence prevention through media in particular, I'd really be grateful for an introduction or just to send them in our direction. Otherwise, thank you for your time today. It's as I said, it's a delight and honor to be here. Oh, 2 more slides. Okay. Every Wednesday, I actually produce we now call it the Weekly Brief on Gun Violence Prevention, close to this title. That's available on our website. You can click on the link for the current newsletter and just enter your email address to get future newsletters every Wednesday for free. They're then excerpted in the Billy Penn website newsletter every Wednesday morning. But it's the best way not only to get the news on gun violence and prevention in Philadelphia, but community views, research, new data. Also there are all sorts of resources there. But it's really I think most importantly the best way to keep up with what we're doing when we're looking for new partners, when we have new programs and new opportunities. So if anyone comes to mind that you think would be a good partner, send them to, and yourself, please subscribe to the newsletter, and it's the best way to stay in touch. Finally, as I said, thank you so much for your time and attention today. I hope I haven't gone on too terribly long. But I'm pretty easy to find, but feel free to email me. I'm very active on Twitter, but I'm easy to find across channels. And there's also a contact button on both of our home pages that will get you to me. So let me know whenever I can be helpful. Thank you so much.